This question gets asked to me at least 50 to 100 times, probably even a month. What focus tree is coming next for Hearts of Iron 4? Now, I don't know, okay, but I can make a reasonable prediction, and you know what's best to celebrate that prediction? By making ourselves a tier list. That's right, this is going to be a tier list of what I think is the most likely next focus tree for Hearts of Iron 4. Let's start out with, I personally think, the obvious. And do you know what the obvious is? Sweden, Denmark, Norway, and Finland. We'll group those together. Personally, hand on heart, I think these four are probably most likely guaranteed to happen. These will happen. The reason this has probably not been done is because, one, these aren't major powers during the war, and their contribution was more or less limited compared to some of the major powers. However, I'm not ranking this S tier because I think the hype behind this one isn't maxed out. I personally think, hand on heart, these are actually going to happen, but I don't think these are going to come in the relative soon. So S tier would be basically, we're going to see this year or next year. A tier maybe yes year later. B is becoming less likely. C, incredibly unlikely. D, I don't even think this is going to happen. Scandinavia is happening, but is it going to happen in the short term? I'm going to probably put my bets on probably no. For real, for Sweden, I could understand they're going to restore like the absolute monarchy for Sweden. And then there was also an idea played around of being like a arms trader, a peaceful arms trader, similar to the way Switzerland is. The concept of that is kind of cool, but remember, it's a war game, so we're not going to be primarily in peacetime for the entire game. Denmark's going to be a strange one. It's going to be a little bit like Poland, like going into exile and be able to do things in the back end. Maybe very similar to the Netherlands too. Norway's really cool because they get invaded. So I feel for the most part, there's going to be a lot of mechanics of trying to hold certain key points like mountain ranges and ports and trying to build up a big navy to try and defend against the Germans, which is a cool concept. And of course, Finland. Finland, I feel like, is going to turn into Spain. If they make Finland and the Winter War similar to Spain, I think they've done a really good thing there. The next one is a difficult one because this one feels like the community spits it out as if it's nothing. You've got to understand that there's a lot of nations in this continent. And if you're going to shout South America at me, cool, that's fine. So there's 10 nations in South America. And I'll admit, some of them, I could understand that might not have big focus trees, such as Ecuador, Paraguay, or Uruguay, even Chile to a certain degree, even Bolivia to a certain degree. I could understand maybe Peru, Colombia, Venezuela, and Brazil would probably have slightly bigger focus trees, probably because they're larger nations and their contribution to the war is slightly larger. But the truth behind it is we understand that these nations have not gained focus trees because their contribution is slightly more limited. One thing I like to say is the most focus trees we've ever got with an expansion is about 5. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to divide them up. And this is just going to be completely arbitrary. Probably Paradox won't even do it the same way I'm going to do it. To be honest with you, apart from Argentina, I can't really see any of these nations getting big focus trees. So honestly, hand on heart, out of all the interesting options, I feel like that's going to be a C tier. Because what's the point of Paradox putting their developer time towards these nations that just played a significantly small role? And to be fair, of all the nations in South America, I think the South ones are the probably less interesting. I can understand Argentina, because with Argentina, what you can do is you can do the Germans in exile in Argentina, can't you? So the kind of role play aspect of that is kind of interesting. But the other ones just feel like they're very small focus trees. You know what? I think we're going to see like a warlord focus tree for South American nations because there's just too many of them. And I don't think that there's too many of them to put into a specific expansion. Honestly, hand on heart, I don't really feel like we're going to see this anytime soon. I feel like it's going to be like Battle for the Bosporus. We'll see it as like an independent expansion that'll just get released in some time. Anyway, the other South American nations, I believe Brazil gets requested frequently. For the most part, I think this one is slightly more likely. And I think the reason why is it's got more interesting nations that people could want to play as, particularly Brazil. How would Brazil even work? I'm not really sure. I feel like they'd make it similar to Turkey, where it'd be a nation where everything's falling apart and you've got to pick up the pieces again. The idea of Peru and like remaking an Incan empire, that sounds kind of cool, right? Colombia, basically making a big navy because you've got access to 2 oceans. You've got access to the Atlantic and you've got access to the Pacific Ocean too. So that's a cool concept, the idea of a big naval power Colombia. Maybe a way of buying the Panama Canal off America if you become a major power, for instance. Venezuela would be very interesting. Can you imagine going fascist as Venezuela and helping the Germans by supplying them with oil and actually propping up their war effort? I think that could make a really interesting focus tree. However, though, once again, don't get your hopes up on this one. I think we will see these major powers in South America get focuses. I don't think the likeliness is going to be too unbelievably high. So just be aware of that. We're not done with the Americas yet. We're not even going to go to the other parts of the world yet, because we have to talk about the Americas. Central America, Latin America. I mean, how many times have you guys played these nations and then formed the United States of Central America? I'll be honest with you, it's a cool goal. And you can kind of become kind of a power, I suppose. But let's be totally real right now, guys. Who's playing these nations? Paradox aren't going to put lots of developer time into these small nations for people to play them maybe once or twice. So for the most part, I really can't see these nations getting independent focus trees. I think what Paradox is probably going to do is do what they did with Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, where they've got shared focus trees, but like little unique branches for each of them. I suppose in a weird way, you could form like an Aztec empire instead of going the United States of Central America and trying to push towards the Mexicans and push into this region too. Maybe you could incite rebellions to make the native Aztec people to rebel against the Mexicans. That's just an idea to play with, you know. The big however, though, is once again, I think the demand for these nations is so unbelievably small. Hand on heart, guys, I'm going to put this next to impossible. There's a chance it might happen because Paradox have said they want to give every nation a focus tree, which credit to them, that's a really ambitious plan. However, these nations are probably ranked the least. I'm going to pop this one on D tier, guys. I think the chance of this one actually happening is very, very, very low. Guys, we're not done in the Americas yet. We're not done. The Caribbean, Cuba, Haiti, Dominican Republic. Is that it? There's only 3. Oh, wow. I thought there was more. Once again, I think this is going to get the Baltic approach here. I think these are going to be non-unique focus trees, and they're basically going to do the same thing. They're going to be like communism, make all of Caribbean rebel, and therefore join like a coalition of Caribbean nations. The only nation here that feels like it could actually stand on its 2 feet is Cuba due to the steel. There's some kind of communist thing you could do with Cuba, and I suppose you could try and unify the Caribbean, but that's the only interesting thing I can really think about, for instance. And to be honest with you, these nations have got a lot of issues with like poverty and whatnot as well, so it's kind of like, would they have bad national spirits that you have to fix? Because that would be an absolute nightmare to fix, wouldn't it? Honestly, guys, hand on heart, this one ranks really low for me. To be honest with you, it actually ranks lower than the Central American nations. This seems even more unlikely. The last African nation to not get a focus tree, and it's Liberia. So I guess the cliche thing to do would be what Ethiopia's currently got, where you're trying to create rebellions in Africa and then unify Africa under a certain banner or Pan-Africanism. Cool concept, I suppose, but to have an African-themed expansion with this, I suppose you'd have to include more African nations. Maybe you'd have like a generic African focus tree. That actually is a really good opportunity. That there's a lot of releasable nations in HOI4, so maybe a lot of these releasables, maybe you could have them as a generic focus tree specifically for that region. It'd be kind of nice to see a different path though and do something more interesting. I suppose another African nation that could probably get a lot of love and attention that could be kind of interesting is Algeria due to its French connections, you know. I suppose there's another possibility of Egypt too, because Egypt is not really historical in HOI4. Egypt had some kind of autonomy and it had some local control, but it's just represented in HOI4 as compliance. So Egypt could be like an integrated puppet of Great Britain, and therefore with that you could give it a focus tree as well. Really interesting possibilities, because it's like Egypt, so you could roll back to an absolute monarchy or roll back to ancient Egypt or something really wonky and weird like that. And it is a big region as well, so there's potential for a lot of cool things to do. Guys, an Africa themed expansion, don't get your hopes up. This is very low. Liberia, maybe they'll look at it potentially with an African inspired expansion, but is there a hunger for this? No. Okay, let's talk about the colonies of the Pacific that for the most part have been ignored. So everyone thought in Together for Victory that the British Malaya would get an expansion and the Dutch East Indies would get a national focus as well when we had Man the Guns, but it was ignored. And then the trifecta is also the Philippines, technically kind of a colony of America, another nation that's just not had a lot of love. But if we're in this region, we might as well look at Siam as well. Siam played a role of siding with the Japanese, so potentially an Eastern themed national focus path specifically for the Pacific would be kind of interesting and be kind of cool as well. What could you do with this though? I suppose the East Indies could try and get the rebellion. It'd be very similar to Together for Victory, wouldn't it? The Philippines would be kind of interesting because you'd somehow need to be more integrated with America. I suppose there'd be some cool options for Siam to expand their borders and form like a greater Siam by merging with Malaysia, Indochina, maybe Burma as well. That'd be a really cool concept, actually. I think I'd really enjoy that as well. To be honest with you, talking about these specific nations doesn't really particularly excite me. This is a possibility. I guess it's slightly more likely than some of these kind of like African nations in the Caribbean. But once again, I won't get your hopes up on these ones as well. I think Siam is definitely up there just based on its role in the war and how it sided with the Japanese. But the other three, I don't know about this, guys. I'm not sure. If they announced tomorrow there was going to be a Philippines national focus, I don't think I'd be very excited. Boom. Oh my goodness. Speaking of the Far East, everyone's favorite meme nations. I think the potential with this one is really good because you can embrace the memes, can't you? I suppose the Greater Tibet, where it consumes the borders it had like in CK3 times. Nepal, I don't know where you would go with this. Maybe you'd give big bonuses to mountaineers. You know, I don't really know the history of these nations very well. To be fair, Nepal and Bhutan had like a lot of neutrality, and Tibet's very pacifism with Buddhism. So it's kind of difficult to see in my mind how they would recreate their former glory and integrate with the World War II style mechanics. It's a tough one, this one. I think there's definitely memes to be played with this, but don't get your hopes up, guys, because this is another one that I feel like Paradox are probably going to look at it, but it's going to take a very long time before they reach that place. So I don't know. I won't get your hopes up, put it that way. We've had a China-based expansion with Waking the Tiger, and I suppose that also included Japan and Manchukuo as well, which had a lot of flavor to it. I really like the Manchukuo focus tree. I like the rebellion aspects of it. But there was a bunch of nations here that were forgotten, that were kind of wedged between the national focuses. One of them was Manchukuo, Mongolia, and then Tanu Tuva. A lot of people did think that these nations were going to get expansions in No Step Back, but they didn't. I think the interesting between Mongolia and Manchukuo is the possibility of forming like a greater Mongolia. And of course, guys, we all know the meme. If you played Kaiserreich, particularly the old Kaiserreich, you know that there's the potential to form the Mongolian Empire and go on a big crusade. It's super ahistorical, but it's super funny and it's super cool. And why the hell not, right? Tano Tuva, on the other hand, once again, I don't really know the backstory to it. Maybe forming like a Turan Empire or a Siberian Empire is a possibility. It'd be kind of cool if you could form it diplomatically, but getting the Soviet Union to agree to this is going to be pretty insane. Guys, another one of these ones where I feel like don't get your hopes up, because I honestly, hand on heart, don't think these are ever going to happen. It's a cool concept, though. I'll admit, forming a greater Mongolia feels really cool to me. I'd really like to do that. Aside from that, though, don't get your hopes up. Then we have the middle of Asia, the Middle East of Asia. There's a lot of focus trees here, boys. There's a lot of focus trees. Honestly, I think what we will see is that Oman and Yemen focus trees that are probably very, very similar. It's going to be another Baltics, basically. Definitely Saudi Arabia tapping into that oil early. I think the idea of a Saudi Arabia that goes fascist and supplies oil to America would be kind of cool. Similar to the Venezuela idea I've had before. I don't know, maybe a Qatarian focus tree. Maybe your goal of Qatar is to use your oil wealth to eventually hold the World Cup. Memes. Once again, this feels like another battle for the Bosporus situation where I feel like these focus trees will be added as a part of a smaller expansion and not be a major update. There's a potential there. Potential. All right, then. Afghanistan. Now Persia, Iran. Now this is going to be so cool. Lots of alt history opportunities here. And then, of course, Iraq. Don't know the history behind it, but I know Iraq has a lot of untapped oil. I suppose Persia does as well. Lots of potential for some really cool shenanigans. To be honest with you, I think there's a lot of people that would like to see these focus trees of these nations. Personally, I'm going to rank these ones a lot higher. I think this is a B tier, and I think there's a potential for people who are hungry for these specific nations would get them. And I think there's a lot of interesting flavor that is a part of these nations that would make the game very interesting. So I'm ranking these ones a lot higher. Are we ready for the highest bingo score? Personally, I think the most likely. Here we go, boys. Belgium. I think there is a lot of potential for Belgium. And I think the reason is because of your colonies in Africa. And the idea of exploiting this region and trying to pull resources out of it, then trying your best to keep the rebellions down would be really cool and concept. Maybe an idea of handing this over to Germany to prevent you from getting invaded. Maybe like prevent you from being a speed bump. Belgium's got a lot of cool potential because once again, it's good industry as well. Everyone's other favorite meme nation, Luxembourg. This is a difficult one because it's such a small nation and such a small industry. What could you do with this is difficult. I suppose forming a grand duchy of Luxembourg is the potential, but you'd have to change some of the states. Maybe becoming a vassal of Germany makes sense because the Germans see Luxembourg as a form of part of Greater Germany, don't they? So maybe becoming a vassal of Germany would be a potential. I think the potential with Luxembourg is kind of limited, to be honest with you. You forgot about it, didn't you? That's right, guys. The Republic of Ireland. This is a good one because causing unrest in Northern Ireland and getting it to form a unified Ireland is just so cool. The idea that you could support the Germans by backstabbing the British would be a perfect thing for Ireland. But then also the potential too of working with the UK to potentially get Northern Ireland back. It all comes around that, I suppose. The only downside with it though is the industry is not very high, so your potential to expand from that region is a bit difficult. We're not done with Europe though. Albania. You forgot about Albania, didn't you? King Zog is a really interesting character. If you guys ever looked him up online, looked at what he did and what his goals, ambitions were for Albania, is really interesting. It's very Death of Dishonor though, isn't it? Because you get the idea of flipping to commie near the end of the war, then being pressured by the Italians, I suppose. Potentially the Greeks could invade you in HOI4 base game as well, because they've got a claim to your south as well. Coring Kosovo? Someone did suggest that. That's a possibility, yeah. Hey, Austria. So I can understand why PDX has ignored Austria up to this point, because it's a nation that just gets eaten in 1938 by Germany. However, we've got Czechoslovakia that's got a focus tree, and that gets eaten by Germany as well. Maybe there's a potential of becoming an autonomous region of Germany and therefore continuing the war. You could potentially play a historical World War II game, but be like an integrated puppet of Germany potentially. And of course, everyone's going to say it. That's right. Austria-Hungary, that Hungary currently has at the moment, would probably be a major factor as well. Oh, what about this? A reverse Anschluss. You basically make Germany have a referendum and then Austria annex Germany. You could have a reverse German Reich, couldn't you? That is a really cool concept. Once again, the possibilities with Austria are so broad due to, of course, it's Europe. It's a modern industrialist nation. It also is a nation that plays a part in the war. You know where this is going, guys. I think these nations are almost certain to happen. So I'm going to give those a big fat S tier. You probably think we're done now, right? You think we're done? We're not done yet. Because we've not talked about reworks. And I think there's a potential for quite a lot of reworks. I think the biggest no-brainer rework is Germany. Germany has been reworked already. However, it doesn't take advantage of the balance of power. It doesn't take advantage of a lot of the new mechanics. Its focus tree, for the most part, is just slightly bare and linear with a few alt history options. It misses the communist path. It wouldn't surprise me in the slightest if Paradox at some point returned to Germany to do a rework of a rework. I'll mention it just for the sake of it. I think a lot of people mention Turkey. I've been vocal about not being a big fan of Turkish focus tree because it's a little bit overly linear. I suppose there's a possibility of a Turkish rework, but man, it's small. And I'm really sorry because I would like to see a Turkish rework, to be honest with you. Now, another one, which I feel like is very unlikely, and some in the chat's reminded me of this, so I'm really thankful for that, is Ukraine and Belarus. So these are very big nations that are part of the Soviet Union. And I personally think there's a lot of flavor there that can be added to make some really interesting choices. However, because we've just had the expansion of No Step Back and these nations aren't independent, they're not a part of the nation, they're just integrated into the Soviet Union. Sadly, hand on heart, these aren't going to happen. I'm not going to beat around the bush. Speaking of reworks, I think the United States has got one of those really weird focus trees where it needs to be nerfed. The problem with the USA is it starts off just insanely strong, mad strong, and you've got like a head start on everyone during the war, and I feel like the USA needs a nerf. I don't mean take away its factories, just give it some more issues it has to deal with internally that you have to fix. This might have been how the United States was during World War II, and that's fine. I love history. It's good. But remember, this is not history. It's a computer game. And I think there needs to be a way of getting to the United States late game that doesn't make it almost like an end boss that's almost barely undefeatable until you get nukes or do a cheeky naval invasion early game before 1940. Maybe this is one of my personal wish lists and it's less about actually needing a rework, which I'll admit Paradox probably say like, USA, why? So I'm probably going to put it on C tier. I'm going to include the United Kingdom on this, and I don't even think the United Kingdom is the nation that has any problems. I think the UK focus tree for the most part is really good, apart from a balance of power that would make it a little bit more flavorful and a bit more interesting. The reason why I've included the UK, I'm talking about Together for Victory. The focus tree for Together for Victory are, for the most part, dated. They're very generic and they're not very interesting. South Africa, Australia, and Canada, they just could do with a little bit of polish and a little bit of flavor. To be honest with you, this is very unlikely, because they're getting a bunch of smaller updates with free patches. So it kind of tells me they don't want to return to them. There's not really much financial reason to actually return to them, to be honest with you. I suppose a final honorable mention would be Czechoslovakia. And the reason why is it got its own focus tree in Death or Dishonor. It's like an enhanced generic focus tree. And I think for the most part, the focus tree is quite one-dimensional, so it's kind of easy to understand for newbies. However, it doesn't have any Czechoslovakian flavor in there other than, well, I guess, the issue between the divided nation between the Slovaks and the Czechs. I suppose it could gain a little bit of flavor, but would it be something that Paradox ever returned to, being it's a nation that gets eaten up in most HOI4 games? Probably not. So for the most part, Czechoslovakia, but honestly, is a nation that could do with an update. However, I feel like it's lacking so much that I feel like it really wouldn't. We'll pop that on C tier. Guys, this is my tier list for the most likely nations to get focus trees in the short term, or potentially get reworks. If it's an individual flag, it is a rework. If it's a bunch of nations, they are fresh, new focus trees. If you enjoyed this video and you want to see more HOI4 goodness, don't forget to like and to subscribe. And if you want the next video, this one will be next for you. Maybe it's HOI, maybe it's a React content, maybe it's some kind of min-maxing meta or an exploit. Give it a click. It is the video for you. Click it. I know you will love it.